Welcome back. So we've seen how surplus value gets turned into new capital, but that's really only half the story. We've now arrived at the absolute culmination of this analysis. What does it all mean for the working class? In Chapter 25 of Capital, Marx pulls back the curtain on what he calls the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation. And he's not just talking about a trend here. He's arguing this is an immanent law, something baked right into the system's code.
And that brings us to the central question that frames this entire chapter. We know capital is driven by this single, relentless impulse to expand. It has to grow. But what is the necessary human cost of that growth? This is the fundamental tension we are going to unpack, step by step.
To really get to the heart of this law, we're going to follow a very precise, logical path. First, we'll quickly touch on the drive to accumulate. Second, we'll dissect the changing makeup or composition of capital itself. Third, we'll see how this change logically creates a surplus population. Fourth, we'll look at the crucial function of that population. And finally, we'll put it all together to state the general law in full. Okay, everything starts right here. The foundational premise, as we've already established, is capital's unending mission to turn surplus value back into more capital. This isn't just one part of the system, it is the engine that powers everything we're about to discuss. And let's be really clear about this. Accumulation isn't some happy accident of production. It is the central driving imperative. As Marx so vividly puts it, capital is dead labor that, vampire-like, only lives by sucking living labor. Its single-minded goal is to absorb the greatest possible amount of surplus labor. So, how does this drive to accumulate actually change the way things are made? To understand that, we have to look under the hood at the core mechanism. You see, it's not just about capital getting bigger, it's about a fundamental change in its technical makeup. This is where we find the real gears of the machine. The entire argument really hinges on understanding one key concept, the organic composition of capital. Just think of it as a ratio. On one side, you've got C for constant capital. That's the money spent on things, machinery, raw materials. On the other side, you've got V for variable capital. That's the money spent on people, on labor power. This C to V ratio is the pivot for everything that follows. Now, this ratio isn't static. It doesn't stay the same. The relentless drive for more surplus value, for a competitive edge, forces capitalists to constantly invest in better, more productive technology. And what does that mean? It means that as accumulation marches on, the slice of the pie going to machinery, the C part, grows way faster than the slice going to labor, the V part. The organic composition of capital is constantly on the rise. Let's put some numbers to this to make it crystal clear. Imagine an early-stage capital of, say, 500 pounds. It might be made up of 200 in machinery and 300 in wages, hiring 300 workers. But as that capital grows to 1,000 pounds and technology gets better, the whole composition shifts. Now it might be 800 in machinery and only 200 in wages, hiring just 200 workers. Pay close attention here. The demand for labor didn't just grow slower than the total capital, it actually fell in absolute terms. So, if that's what's happening to the structure of capital, let's trace the direct and, according to this analysis, the necessary consequence. What happens to the working population when capital itself changes its form in this way? The logic here is really a causal chain. One thing leads to the next. Capitalists accumulate. To boost productivity, they invest more in constant capital. This means the variable part of their capital, the part that buys labor, shrinks relative to the whole investment. And the inevitable result? A portion of the workforce is made redundant. They are, as Marx says with some serious irony, set free, freed from their means of making a living. This brings us to another key definition, the relative surplus population. It's really important to get this right. This isn't about a country having too many people in some absolute sense. No, it's about a population that is surplus relative to the constantly changing needs of capital for its own expansion. And this leads us to the core thesis of the chapter. This surplus population, what we'd now call unemployment or the precariously employed, is not presented as a market failure or some temporary glitch. It's argued to be a necessary and unavoidable product of the process of accumulation itself. It's a feature, not a bug. But here's the crucial twist. This surplus population isn't just a waste product that gets cast aside. In a fascinating turn, it's immediately pulled back into the system as a vital component, as a lever for capital's continued expansion. The formal name for this functional population is the Industrial Reserve Army. It's this pool of unemployed and underemployed workers that gives capital the incredible flexibility it needs. It's the ready supply of human material for sudden expansions, for opening new industries, or for scaling up existing ones without wages immediately skyrocketing. Marx argues this reserve army becomes the pivot upon which the law of demand and supply of labor works. Think about that. He's saying it isn't just another factor in the labor market. It is the very mechanism that keeps that market operating within limits that are convenient for the domination of capital. It fundamentally puts a cap on the bargaining power of every single worker who has a job. So you see, this reserve army is doing several crucial things all at once. Its mere existence puts downward pressure on the wages of the employed. It provides that super flexible workforce. It enforces discipline. The threat of being replaced is always there. And it acts like a kind of regulator for the whole business cycle, getting bigger during crises and smaller during booms. All right, we've got all the pieces on the board now. We've got the drive to accumulate, the rising organic composition, and the functional role of this reserve army. Now we can finally bring it all together to state the overarching principle that Marx derives from this whole analysis. Here's the first part of the law. It's a direct, positive correlation. The more capital accumulates, the more social wealth there is. The larger the relative size of this surplus population becomes. The very same cause that expands capital also expands the reserve army. And that leads directly to the law's dramatic and famous conclusion: a fundamental polarization. The exact same process that accumulates wealth at one pole must, by its own internal logic, accumulate misery at the other, on the side of the very class whose labor creates all that wealth in the first place. So let's just boil this down to its absolute core propositions. First, capital accumulation isn't neutral. It necessarily produces a reserve army of labor. Second, this army isn't a flaw in the system. It's a functional prerequisite. Third, this logic leads to a structural polarization of wealth and misery. And finally, this is the really counterintuitive part: a worker's overall condition, their precarity, can actually get worse even as capital grows and even as wages might be rising, because the very mechanics of that growth deepen their dependency on the system. So we've now laid out the general law that governs how the system reproduces itself and expands. But, this just begs a final massive question. How did this whole system, this division between owners of capital and free laborers, how did it come into being in the first place? That is the question of so-called primitive accumulation, and that's exactly what we'll turn to next.